All right, what's up, guys? Today I want to talk about range finders and range finding and some of the different considerations that go into that for us as civilians viewing this through the lens of civil defense. So let's get started. And this will be a rather short deal where I can kind of pretty briefly go ahead and get my points across, and we can talk about some different equipment and pros and cons associated with these different items. So, generally speaking, when we talk about range finding, it's going to consist of two categories. I listed a third as well. We can just consider that as a bonus or an extra. So, number one is going to be active range finders, and then we're going to have passive range finding equipment, and then we're going to have visual estimation or eyeballing. As you can see pictured here is a SIG laser rangefinder. That is my personally owned one, and it is the Buckmaster's 1800. So it's usable out to approximately 1800 yards. Not a bad little piece of equipment, and not very expensive either. So when you compare it to some other offerings anyway. So moving forward, let's go to our next page, and we will discuss a little bit more in depth active range finding. So what does that mean? This is going to cover essentially what we commonly imagine when we think about a rangefinder. These are electronic optics that commonly have a fixed magnification, and they use an infrared, aka IR, laser emitter to laze an object and measure the distance from the device to said object. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So moving on. Let's talk about some pros and cons of active rangefinders. So pros, accuracy of measurements is going to be a big deal. Also, ease and speed of use. You don't have to be concerned with doing any calculations or notes or math or crunching numbers or anything like that or using formulas. It's just basically point and shoot. So that's definitely a pro in my opinion. Another attribute is minimal training, if any at all. These things are pretty intuitive. Some of them have some more settings and stuff like that once you get into the menu, but it's not really something that's very complicated. And another pro, I guess you could list, is that they are standard among hunters and sportsmen, pretty much all over the United States of America and probably even beyond that throughout the world. So they are commonly used items. So let's talk about some cons. So electronic devices, and they do require batteries. So that could be an issue, right? Especially if we start looking at supply chain or logistical issues where we may not be able to access batteries to keep these devices running into the future. That could be a consideration that we need to take a look at. Another con is that they do emit a laser signature, although it is in our spectrum and it's invisible to the naked human eye. With the prevalence of night vision devices and so forth, and even cameras that can pick up infrared lights and lasers, then that may be something that you need to take into consideration depending on how you're going to use these devices and in what type of environment. Like if you're going to be in a contested environment, a lot of folks have night vision now. Even if it's just digital night vision, then that may be something that you need to take a look at. And another con or potential con is that these things do tend to cost more, right? So you can pick up some for anywhere from probably $100, maybe even cheaper. I don't know if I would recommend that though, because again, you kind of get what you pay for. You could spend well upwards of hundreds of dollars depending on brand, features, quality, etc. So if you're going to be using this thing in a field environment, you are going to want something that's going to be shock proof, fog proof, water resistance, etc. are going to be things that you may want to look for. And just overall durability, right? You don't want something that can't withstand a drop or anything like that. That's just going to be basically a toy for the most part. So spend a little bit of extra money and get one that's at least decent, right? Same as anything else. So moving on, let's talk about passive rangefinding. So there are several tools that fall into this category. Some are more complex than others. One example that I'm familiar with is the Range R card by Black Hills. And it's a very simple tool, and I personally enjoy using it. The Range R card is a low cost and virtually idiot proof solution for the civil defender. And other popular options use MILS or MOA in combination with an optics reticle to determine ranges of common objects, like for instance, an average sized adult male. And as you can see pictured here is one of those ranging cards that will use MIL or MOA. I'm not really familiar with that one, but I've seen it around in different places. I've even seen them on Amazon. But again, that may require additional equipment, which we will discuss here in a minute. So pros and cons of passive rangefinders. Pros are going to be lower costs. Like I said, these are very simple items, typically a card or something like that. And no electronics or batteries needed. So that could be important as well, right? You don't have to worry about maintaining another set of batteries or supply of batteries. Again, by the time you look around, you're constantly having to have batteries for different items, and that could get to be a little bit overwhelming or a little bit much depending on the circumstances. So another pro, in my opinion, would be no signature emitted when used. So therefore, you're not blasting off an infrared laser signature into the atmosphere that could potentially be exploited by some sort of an adversary, right? And again, that may not be a realistic concern for most folks in the civilian space, but it is something that we need to at least have a discussion about and be aware of. We at least have to understand what's happening when we're doing that, and understand that there is a possibility for that to be utilized against us. So that's just something to be aware of. So let's talk about some cons or downsides to passive rangefinders. They are going to be a little slower to use, right? Some of them may be dependent on your eyesight as well. If you got corrected vision or poor vision, then you may struggle using some of these different items, like something like a Range R card. It may require additional gear like a scope in MIL or MOA, depending on what kind of card you're using, right? And they also may require formulas or training, math. Essentially, you may be required to do some sort of calculations to come up with your range estimate. So that could be a turnoff or a drawback for some folks as well. And depending on how fast you need to be acquiring the range, that could be something that could be viewed as a con as well. And they are also potentially less accurate measurements and more susceptible to human error, right? Because again, you're getting into doing math and different formulas and stuff like that, crunching numbers, doing equations, so on and so forth. And we're just humans, so sometimes we make mistakes, especially if you start introducing outside stressors like weather or environmental concerns, not to mention in the event that you're in a high stress situation, right? Then that may be something that is just not feasible for you. All right, so moving on to the next slide, we have visual estimation or eyeballing. This method may be acceptable in some circumstances when higher accuracy isn't really necessary, right? Your success may vary on an individual basis because some people are better at guessing or estimating distances than others, especially with practice and exposure. That may lead to some success with this method. Again, if you're familiar with that, a lot of people, depending on what kind of job you may do for a living or what kind of trade you may be in, some people are just better at guessing distances than other people are. It's just one of those things, right? So I believe it's still important to validate your assumptions as part of the learning process when we're talking about using this method or even getting familiar with eyeballing distances. So what I mean by that is something that we can talk about here. And you can do this in a relatively simple exercise, especially if you have a laser rangefinder. That way you can, like I mentioned, validate any of your assumptions and use that as part of the learning process so that you can reinforce and understand whether or not you're close or far off in your estimates. And then you can kind of make mental notes of that, put it in a memory bank, and then you'll begin to build up that skill as you use it more. So what you can do is take your laser rangefinder out and try to guess distances to objects around you in your environment. This can be in your neighborhood, in your yard. This can be on your lunch break at work, whatever, right? It doesn't really matter. You can be at the park with your kids. So what you're going to do is make a guess of a distance on some object around you, right, in your environment. And then you can use the rangefinder, your laser rangefinder, to determine the actual distance, and then make a mental note of how close or far off you are in your guess. And with practice, you will be able to get better at eyeballing distances, right? Now, this isn't a perfect method, and this isn't something that you would want to use if you needed a high level of accuracy to make a low percentage shot on a target, you know, out at distance or something like that, right? Everything has a time and a place. But it is something that I think could be a benefit to us to have at least a little bit of an idea of being able to eyeball distances. It's something that comes in handy in day-to-day life as well, in my experience. So, in conclusion, we're here and we're going to discuss takeaways. So, being able to determine distance or range of people, animals, and objects can be critical in civil defense operations. I think we can all agree on that. There are multiple ways to accomplish this, as we have discussed here during this presentation. Not all methods will be suitable for all scenarios, of course. And blasting off laser emissions from rangefinders may not be a good idea in a contested environment, as we mentioned, especially with more widely adopted use of night vision equipment and IR-enabled cameras. It is my recommendation to have both an active and passive method of ranging available to you and your respective team when conducting exercises. As usual, I am no expert, and I'm not claiming to be one. I'm not even playing one on YouTube. And may your experiences continue to guide you. I appreciate you guys, and I will see y'all on the next one. Hopefully you found value in this and hit the buttons for me. I'm out.